I once asked Grok what the Sahara had always been, and who belonged there. The answer was simple. This was the largest hot desert on Earth, a barrier of sand and stone, its peoples arriving late enough that history could trace them. Then the sand gave up its dead. 2 women, laid in a rock shelter in what is now southwestern Libya, naturally mummified, 7,000 years old, their skin and tissue still intact. For years, the assumption was plain. These were desert herders whose ancestors had wandered in from somewhere to the east, carrying their cattle across the green land the Sahara used to be. In 2025, their own DNA said something else entirely. They matched no known population on Earth, a branch of humanity no one knew had existed. And the truth was stranger than the emptiness anyone had imagined. To understand what the desert was hiding, you have to understand what the desert used to be. Today, the Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, a wall of sand and rock stretching across the top of a continent, brutal and dry and very nearly empty. Rain almost never comes. The ground bakes. In the deep interior, a person can walk for days and find nothing that wants them alive. It is one of the most hostile landscapes anywhere, and everything about it says that nothing could have lived here for long. But the sand is lying about its own past. Roughly 14,500 years ago, the climate turned, and it kept turning until the desert was gone. Scientists call the period that followed the African humid period, and for thousands of years it rewrote this entire region. The monsoon rains pushed north, the dunes gave way to grassland. Where there is nothing now, there were lakes and rivers and wide green savannah running to the horizon. This was not a scattering of oases. This was a living world. The lakes held fish. The plains held elephants and hippopotamuses and the herds that fed on open grass. One body of water that formed in the eastern Sahara is estimated to have grown to something close to the size of modern Germany, an inland sea in a place that today cannot keep a puddle. For a stretch of time measured in thousands of years, the hardest desert on the planet was one of the most inviting places a person could stand. And people did stand in it. They hunted along the water. They gathered. Later, they brought animals. The Green Sahara drew human life into its center the way any fertile country does, and for a long while it held them there in comfort. Near the border between Libya and Algeria, in a range of mountains called the Tadrart Akakus, there is a shelter cut into the rock. It is known today as Takarkori. Now it sits in open desert, reachable only by driving across hard ground in a vehicle built for it. But 7,000 years ago, the people who lived beneath that overhang did not look out on sand. They looked out on water. A lake sat in the valley below, present for much of the year, and around it the grass and the animals and the whole machinery of a wet, living landscape. It was a good place to be, sheltered from the sun, raised above the valley floor, close to everything a person needed. And so people came and stayed and came again across generation after generation, until the shelter held the layered record of a world that would later be denied, because it did not last. The rains that made the Green Sahara were never permanent. Around 5,500 years ago, the monsoon began to fail, and the water pulled back, and the grass thinned, and the Great Lakes shrank toward the crusted beds you can still trace from the air. The desert returned the way it had left, slowly and then completely, until the savannah was buried and the animals were gone and the rivers were only shapes in the stone. The people scattered or died out or moved on, and the sand closed over the country they had known. But the shelter at Takarkori kept what the desert took. Sealed above the old lake bed, protected from the worst of the wind, it held the remains of the people who had lived there when the land was green. And among them lay 2 bodies the returning desert had preserved with terrible care, waiting 7,000 years to be explained. The work of finding them began in 2003. A joint Libyan and Italian team, archaeologists from Sapienza University in Rome working alongside the Department of Antiquities in Tripoli, came to the shelter at Takarkori to read what the layers held. The excavation was led by Savino di Lernia, and it did not take long to reward them. On the second day of digging, they scratched back the sand and found a human jaw. They had barely started, and the shelter had already begun to give up its dead. What they uncovered over the seasons that followed was not a single grave, but a burial ground. 15 people had been laid to rest beneath that overhang across the life of the settlement, and every one of them was either a woman or a child. 2 of those bodies were something rarer than bone. They were adult women, buried roughly 7,000 years ago, and the desert had not let them decay. Their skin had survived. Their ligaments and tissue had survived. They had become natural mummies, and nothing about them was the work of human hands. No one embalmed them. No one removed the organs or wrapped the limbs or spoke the words that Egypt would later make famous. The dryness did all of it, drawing the water out of the flesh until what remained simply held its shape across 7,000 years. These are among the oldest mummies anywhere on Earth, and the desert made them by accident, keeping 2 women intact long enough to be questioned. And the shelter around them told the story of how they had lived. This was not a camp of desperate survivors clinging to a dying land. These were people settled into a good country. The floor held grinding stones, worn smooth against the seeds and grain they processed. There were the remains of huts and fireplaces where the same hearths had burned across generations. There was pottery, and inside the pottery, chemistry preserved a detail that reached far beyond one shelter. Traces of milk fat, soaked into the clay, are the oldest evidence of dairying anywhere on the African continent. These people did not merely keep animals, they milked them. They had built a way of life around their herds, cattle, and sheep and goats, and they had done it early enough to leave the first record of it on the continent. The land around them carried the same signature. Across the Tadrart Akakus, on the walls of shelters like this one, people had painted and carved the world they knew. Herders and their animals, cattle standing in scenes of a green country. The rock art of these mountains is among the richest anywhere, a record left in stone by people who watched their herds move across grassland that no longer exists. Everything about Takarkori spoke of a settled, capable, pastoral people who had made a home in the heart of what would become the harshest desert on Earth, back when it was nothing of the kind. So the shelter answered a great deal. It showed how they lived and what they ate, and how they buried their dead, and how long they stayed. But it could not answer the one question that mattered most. It could not say who they were. The bones spoke, and the pottery spoke, and the painting spoke, and all of them together left the deepest question untouched. Where had these people come from? And the one record that might have answered it, the record written inside the bodies themselves, stayed sealed. Ancient DNA does not survive heat, and the Sahara is nothing but heat. For years, the 2 women kept their answer intact in every way but the one that counted. So the question was answered the only way it could be, without the bodies. And for a long time, the answer everyone reached for pointed in the same direction. These were herders. They kept cattle and sheep and goats. They milked them. They built a life around their animals. And herding, as far as anyone could trace it, did not begin here. It began far to the east, in the Near East, in the lands where people first tamed animals and planted the first fields. That was the cradle of the whole way of life. So the reasoning ran in a straight line. If the people at Takarkori were herders, and herding came from the east, then the herders themselves must have come from the east as well, walking their animals west into a Sahara that had turned green enough to cross. It was a clean story, and the green Sahara made it cleaner. When the rains returned and the grassland spread, the desert stopped being a wall. It became a bridge, a wet, living corridor running across the top of the continent, joining places that the sand had always kept apart. And a corridor is made for movement. Through it, the thinking went. People could have flowed in every direction, north and south and east, carrying their herds and their tools and their blood across the whole width of North Africa. The Sahara had opened, and populations had poured through it and mixed freely along the way. The herders at Takarkori were simply one current in that larger flow, newcomers who had followed the grass to a good valley and settled beside its lake. The evidence that could be seen seemed to fit. The animals themselves were not African in origin. Cattle and sheep and goats had been domesticated elsewhere and had to have arrived from somewhere, and the obvious somewhere was the East. The rock art showed herders and their beasts, a whole imported way of living painted onto the walls. Everything visible pointed outward, toward a homeland beyond the desert, toward a journey these people had made to reach the place they died. It seemed almost self-evident. A new way of life meant new people. Herds that came from outside meant herders who came from outside. The arrow pointed into the Sahara from somewhere else, and every reading of the visible record traced it the same way. But there was a limit to what the visible record could ever prove. Pottery can be copied, a technique can be taught. Animals can be traded from one people to the next without a single family ever moving. Everything the archaeologists could hold in their hands showed what these people did, and none of it could show who these people were. A way of life can travel without the people who invented it, and there was no way to tell, from a grinding stone or a painted wall, whether the herders of Takarkori were migrants who had carried their world with them, or locals who had simply adopted a good idea. The objects could not settle it, only the people could. And the people would not speak. The one record that could have decided the matter was the record written inside the two women, in their genomes, in the code that carries ancestry across thousands of years. That record does not care what a pot suggests or a painting implies. It states plainly where a person came from. But it had never been read, because it could not be. Ancient DNA breaks down in heat, and the Sahara offers nothing else. The answer was locked inside the bodies, sealed by the same desert that had preserved everything else about them, and no one had yet found a way to open it. Then someone opened it. The work was done at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, one of the few places on Earth built to pull genetic code from remains this old and this badly kept. The first crack came around 2019, when the team managed to recover mitochondrial DNA from the two women, a small thread of ancestry passed down the maternal line. It was a start, but it was only a fragment. The real prize was the whole genome, the full genetic record inherited from both parents, and reading that from bodies baked in the Sahara for 7,000 years should not have been possible. By 2025, they had done it. The full study appeared in the journal Nature that April, led by a researcher named Nada Salem, with the geneticist Johannes Kraus as its senior author. Kraus called the survival of these genomes a small miracle, and he was not exaggerating. The desert that destroys DNA had, for once, kept just enough. The team read the two women against a vast reference, roughly 800 people living today, drawn from across Africa, the Near East, and Southern Europe, and more than 100 ancient genomes on top of them. The logic going in was simple, and it was the same logic the migration story depended on. If these herders had walked in from somewhere else, that homeland would be written into their DNA. Ancestry does not vanish. A population that arrives from the East carries the East inside it, and the signal would be there to find. So the team went looking for it. Find the homeland in the code, and you find the road these people traveled to reach the lake. The road was not there. There was no signal of migration from the Near East. No genetic fingerprint of herders who had crossed the green Sahara from some distant cradle. The women at Takarkori did not trace back to any incoming population at all. Instead, their DNA pointed inward, to a lineage that had been in North Africa far longer than any migration theory had reached for. This was a previously unknown branch of humanity, one that had split away from the populations of sub-Saharan Africa around 50,000 years ago, at roughly the same moment that modern humans were spreading out of Africa to fill the rest of the world. And then, having split, it had stayed. Isolated. Sealed off in the north for tens of thousands of years, marrying among itself, absorbing almost no one. These were not newcomers who had followed the grass. They were a deeply rooted local people, descendants of a population that had held this corner of the continent since the depths of the Ice Age. Their closest known relatives were not herders from the east at all. They were foragers who had lived 15,000 years ago at a place called Tafaralt, in what is now Morocco, hunter-gatherers of an ancient North African world that predated the Green Sahara entirely. And the thread ran deeper still, reaching back toward a single individual who had lived 45,000 years ago in what is now Europe, a faint echo of just how old this lineage truly was. These people had roots that went down and down. So the migration story collapsed on the one piece of evidence it could not argue with. The herders of Takarkori had not come from anywhere. They had always been there. And that only sharpened the mystery into something harder. If these people never migrated, if their blood was old and local and sealed, then where had their cattle come from? And who exactly were they descended from, that they matched no living population on Earth? The answer is that they belonged to a people who had almost vanished from the record entirely. Geneticists had suspected this lineage existed long before they ever held it. It showed up as a kind of shadow, a set of faint signals buried inside the DNA of living North Africans, hints of an ancestry that had no body attached to it, a ghost, a population that could be inferred but never seen, sensed only as an echo threaded through the people who came after. For years it was exactly that, a shape the data required and no one could point to. Then the two women came out of the Sahara, and the ghost had a face. Here, in the flesh, was the lineage itself, preserved where no one had thought to look. What made it a ghost was its isolation. This branch of humanity had split near the very moment our species began spreading across the planet, and while the rest of that great dispersal went out and mixed and remixed with everyone it met, this lineage did the opposite. It stayed in North Africa and sealed itself off. Across the Ice Age and into the warm millennia that followed, it barely let anyone in, holding its bloodline nearly untouched while the world beyond it churned. By the time the two women were born, they carried an ancestry that had been running alone for tens of thousands of years, which is why it matched no living population as a whole. The intact lineage had survived almost nowhere else. It had mostly dissolved into others, leaving only the echo. Their DNA carried one more mark of that long isolation, and it has to be stated carefully. These women had Neanderthal ancestry in them, but very little. Far less than people living outside Africa, whose ancestors mixed with Neanderthals directly. Yet they carried more of it than sub-Saharan Africans do, a faint trace that had to have come from somewhere. The reading is that a thin thread of contact once reached this lineage from outside Africa, enough to leave a whisper of Neanderthal code and no more. Not a highway of migration, a trace, just enough to show that the wall around these people was never quite total. And that is where the real strangeness sits, because the wall was around their blood and nowhere else. These were herders. They kept cattle and sheep and goats. They milked them, they shaped pottery. They built the whole apparatus of a pastoral life. Not one piece of that began with them. The animals came from outside. The techniques came from outside. The entire way of living had been invented elsewhere and had somehow reached them in their sealed corner of the desert. They took all of it, and they took none of the people who brought it. The knowledge crossed the border, their blood never opened. This is what the genomes finally settled, and it overturns the assumption the whole migration story rested on. The herds did not arrive on the backs of migrating herders. They arrived as ideas. Cattle and the craft of keeping them moved across the green Sahara from group to group, passed along, traded, taught, spreading by contact rather than conquest. The people of Takarkori adopted a new world without being replaced by it, isolated by ancestry and wide open to everything else. It is a combination that sounds impossible, two opposite things describing one people at one time, and yet the two women prove it. They were the last clear face of a ghost lineage, living alone in the sand by blood and connected to the whole moving continent by everything they had learned. The Sahara had hidden not a lost tribe, but a lost branch. Step back, and the scale of what these two women rewrote becomes clear. This was never only a story about two bodies in a shelter. It was a correction to how the whole of North Africa had been peopled. The old picture had newcomers flowing across the green Sahara and remaking the population as they came. The genomes replaced it with something far older and far stiller. A deeply rooted lineage that had held this ground since the late Ice Age, that was neither swept away nor absorbed when farmers and herders spread through the region from the Near East. It stayed, it persisted, and it did not simply die out when the desert returned. Its legacy lives on today, diluted, threaded into the ancestry of modern North Africans, who carry a share of this ghost inside them without ever having known it was there. At the center of it sits a lesson that keeps unsettling researchers. Genes and culture do not have to travel together. A people can take up an entire way of life, the animals, the milking, the pottery, the whole imported world, and remain, in their blood, exactly who they always were. The thing a people do and the people a people are can be two completely separate records, running side by side without ever merging. The herders of Takarkori adopted the future without becoming anyone else, and their DNA proves that borrowing a world and joining a bloodline are not the same act. But the answer did not close every question, and it is worth being honest about what remains open. The study rested on just two individuals. Two genomes, however carefully read, are a narrow window onto a lineage that once spread across a continent, and a wider sample could complicate the picture in ways these two women cannot show. There is a deeper bias, too. DNA survives only in the best preserved bodies, in the rare remains the desert happened to keep, which means the record we can read is skewed toward the lucky few and silent about everyone else. The genomes tell us the truth. They do not necessarily tell us the whole of it. And the framing has to stay honest, because the easy version of this story gets it wrong. It is often said that these women match no human on Earth, and that is only true in a narrow sense. Their lineage matches no living population intact, as a whole and unmixed. But it was never outside our species, and it never vanished completely. These were fully modern humans, rooted in Africa like all of us, and their ancestry survives in diluted form to this day. The mystery is not that they were something other than human. The mystery is that they were a branch of humanity so old and so sealed that it faded almost everywhere before anyone knew to look for it. There is one more limit, and it is not a scientific one. The Sahara is not finished being read, but the reading has stopped. The shelter at Takarkori sits in a country that political unrest has closed to fieldwork since 2011, and the wider desert holds untold sites that no one can safely reach. Whatever else the sand is keeping, it keeps for now behind circumstance rather than chemistry. So the honestest position is the one the evidence supports and no further. The DNA fixed who these people were with a certainty nothing before had approached. It settled where they came from and how they lived and what they carried in their blood. But how a ghost lineage survived alone for so long, and what became of it as the green world died around them, is a story still buried, waiting in the sand. Return to the shelter and to the two women the desert kept. 7,000 years, and their skin and tissue survived, laid above a lake that is now only a shape in the stone, in a green country long since buried under sand. For years they were treated as newcomers, herders assumed to have wandered in from somewhere east. Their own DNA revealed something stranger. They were the last clear face of a branch of humanity that split near the dawn of our species' journey across the world, and then survived alone in a desert that had not yet become one, a ghost lineage that lives on now only as fragments carried inside others, and the Sahara still holds the rest. Sealed sites. Fieldwork stopped by circumstance, a genetic record buried in the sand, still largely unread, waiting the way these two women waited to be explained.